Hello, everyone, and welcome to OpenObservability Talks. I'm your host, Dotan Horovits, and here at OpenObservability Talks, we talk about anything DevOps, observability, and open source. So may the open source be with you. And for those joining us on the live stream on YouTube or Twitch, feel free to share questions and comments on the live chat. Definitely going to make some things more interesting for us and opportunity for you to ask the experts. I'm also glad to share that next week, for those on the live stream, next week on October 24th, 2024, there's Open Source Observability Day, a virtual community conference dedicated to, well, my favorite topic, open source observability. So this event is online and free for everyone to attend. So do check it out. Our show here, OpenObservability Talks, is a community sponsor at this event. Lots of fascinating key speakers, such as Charity Majors of Honeycomb, Alexander Valyalkin from Victoriometrics, Peter Zaitsev from Corroot and Percona, and many others. I'll also have the privilege of speaking there about OpenTelemetry. So do join us on Open Source Observability Day. I'm also going to paste it here for the folks on the live stream. Do check it out. And with that, let's move on to today's episode. And today's episode is about Jaeger. Jaeger is a known name in the open observability space. We've been discussing it extensively here on the show. I think that I actually started as an internal tool at Uber, as you might know, and today it's an open source project under the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. In fact, it's a graduated project alongside Kubernetes, Prometheus, and a few others, so a very veteran one. And the big news are the Jaeger V2 that is coming, the second major release after long overdue, after many, many years. And I invited for today's episode Yuri Shkuro, the creator of Jaeger back in the Uber days, and today he's an observability engineer at Meta and a core maintainer of Jaeger, to tell us all about this major release. So let me invite Yuri to the front stage. Hey, Yuri.
Hello.
Good morning. Where are you joining us from?
From Long Island, New York State.
Okay, cool. So we're on the different side of the globe these days, and yeah, you've been there from day one. It's a pleasure having you actually back on the show because we had an episode together, actually, I think a couple of years ago about distributed tracing and actually using distributed tracing for use cases that maybe people are not aware, like FinOps and the BizOps scenarios. I'm actually pasting it here on the comments for the folks on the live chat. Obviously, I'll also put all the links also in the show notes for the folks consuming it on the podcast app. So don't worry about that. But that was a fascinating episode and way long overdue for you to come back on the show and tell us a bit about the latest and greatest. So really glad to have you here with us today.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be back.
Yeah, and we've been covering, as I mentioned, Jaeger here on the show for many years. Actually, I think one of the first episodes I hosted here on the show was with Albert Teo from the Jaeger maintainer team, and who also used to work at Uber back in the early days of Jaeger at Uber as an internal tool. And he gave back in the day very good tips on how you folks essentially used it at Uber in massive scale architecture that you had back then. So again, for those who are looking for some extra listens, I'm putting here the link on for the folks on the live stream. I'll add it also on the chat. But definitely sounded like a fascinating journey that you had at Uber on that regard. And now, before obviously the main highlight is V2, but I want to take a step before that and talk about V1.x. There have been quite a few things also been done on 1.x, some of them actually leading to the main themes of 2.0. So I want to maybe spend, before we move to 2.0, recap on the last half a year or maybe a bit longer, the main things that you'd like to highlight regarding version 1 and the latest there.
Sure. I think the main changes in V1 related to that, obviously we started supporting OTLP, OpenTelemetry data format directly in Jaeger. That was probably like 2 years ago now, since we've introduced that. And originally it was opt-in, then we made it a default, so you always have the ports open with OTLP receivers. And we've used OpenTelemetry collectors code for that from the start. We said like, yeah, we just like import those receivers and not reinvent the wheel. We've relied on translation from OpenTelemetry to Jaeger data model, which was also implemented in the collector space. So it's kind of, there's been like a lot of synergy between the two projects, and some of the contrib projects and collectors import Jaeger, so we have this nasty circular dependency still going on, which was a bit broken up by like the multi-module organization of collector, but it's still there logically. So I think with this change, we will be able to break it completely and just like have it one direction. And so the other change is, so we've introduced OpenTelemetry format on the backend as a data format that we accept, and then we also made the UI understand that as a like you can upload the file in OpenTelemetry, so that if you have a collector, you can use like a log exporter. It will write data in the hotel JSON, and then you can upload it into Jaeger UI. Even though like UI itself doesn't actually understand OTLP, it will send it back to the backend, translate into Jaeger format. And so this is one of the long-term plans that we at some point do want to consider making the UI more like hotel native. But that's a very big undertaking because there's lots of dependencies on the specific data model in the UI, obviously. I think a lot more than in the backend potentially. And yeah, so those are like I think the main hotel relate. Oh no, I guess the third big one is the fact that we sunset the Jaeger SDKs. So once we started receiving hotel data, I think we've realized that, okay, well, now there is not that much need for us to keep maintaining Jaeger SDKs, because that's been a lot of work. They've been like, I think, pioneers in many areas with like adaptive sampling and the baggage support. But at this point, most of those features are supported by hotel SDKs, and that's where the momentum is for the developer community. So there's no reason for us to kind of keep bifurcated ecosystem, and it's less work on us to maintain. So I was happy to do that. And so now we've sunset them. That means that the UDP-based span exports are no more. I mean, we still support them as of today, but in the next release in Jaeger, we're going to remove the Jaeger agent completely. We announced it sunsetting about a year ago, but now it will be gone. And so that will be a breaking change in V1, so that we don't have to have as many breaking changes in V2 later.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, it's very, we already hear, and this is why I said some of the changes that we've made in 1.x led to 2.0, because I think the shift towards tighter integration with OpenTelemetry started deep within version 1. And definitely this is, we're going to talk about it in a second about Open. I also titled this episode about the alignment with OpenTelemetry, because definitely it's a major theme. And I think if we zoom out and look at the architecture, so Jaeger in the early days used to be really end-to-end from the instrumentation side with the traces, what used to be called traces, essentially SDKs, and obviously the API based on OpenTracing, and then there was the agent, Jaeger agent, and then on the back end, the Jaeger query engine and the Jaeger UI, obviously. So it was really all the way from the application instrumentation all the way to the backend analytics and visualization. And with the introduction of OpenTelemetry, the thing that we see is that the scope is narrowing down. So all the part about the instrumentation is now offloaded to the native SDKs, or the OpenTelemetry SDKs, the client library. And we'll talk about soon about the agent that is being replaced with OpenTelemetry based. And so how, if you look at this evolution, and maybe also looking, how do you describe the scope or the changing, the evolving scope of Jaeger in that respect of the pipeline of telemetry?
Right. So I don't think necessarily there was a conceptually big scope change, because Jaeger primarily was always about a tracing backend and the analysis tool, right? Like visualization and the UI. The fact that we had SDKs was more of a necessity at the time, because when the project started, there was absolutely no standards for tracing instrumentation, and instrumenting your application for tracing is probably the most expensive part of onboarding onto tracing solution of any kind. Some vendors used to have sort of like auto instrumentation, which is working good in some areas, not so good in other areas, because you can't capture any business specific information that way. And so from the early days, Jaeger was a big supporter of OpenTracing, because OpenTracing allowed you to actually instrument your code once and not keep changing it for every vendor you work with, right? And so Jaeger SDK is implemented.
Just important to say, this was on the unified API level of unified abstraction.
Right. And so SDK is implemented that API, but you could easily swap that for another SDK. But again, at that time, every tracing platform or backend or vendor, they would provide you their own SDKs. And nonetheless, there was no commonality in how those SDKs worked. It was mostly like at the OpenTracing API, there was a synergy. And then so OpenTracing evolved into OpenTelemetry, and OpenTelemetry made one big change in that, providing not just an API, but also a standard SDK that a lot of people collaborate on, and so you can use it in any application. So it's sort of like still the same model, because the thing that your application is exposed to is the API, not the SDK. But if you want to physically export the data from the application, you do need an SDK. And so now OTel provides you a standard way of doing that. And so that, I think, sort of like, I don't, technically, yes, it did reduce the scope, but it was never something that we really cared about. It's something that we had to do to provide an end-to-end solution, and now we don't have to. And so I was very happy saying like, yeah, let's move to the standard and not spend cycles in our sort of like projects to maintain these bespoke SDKs that no one else really needs other than Jaeger backend.
And by the way, I think this is where I see the whole industry shifting, not just open source projects, but also commercial offerings, that you see that with the introduction of OpenTelemetry, and it's becoming a de facto standard or widely adopted, definitely on the tracing side, you see vendors adopting it and putting less effort on that, obviously not expecting anymore to monetize from instrumentation agents, and shifting instead the differentiation and the innovation into the backend analytics side. So I think this is also something we see as a trend in the industry, and definitely makes sense, because it's pretty much table stakes how you collect spans, tie them back to trace based on causality, and then maybe do some sampling. The interesting part comes at the back end. So I definitely think this makes perfect sense. And so you talked about significant changes during version 1, and version 1 has been around for 7 years or so. I think like 60 something minor releases, right?
Yeah.
or something like that. So why now, and why V2?
So we wanted to do V2 for a few years already, and we weren't quite sure what that would mean originally. And then when the OpenTelemetry collector initiative started, in fact, I think what's interesting is that the OpenTelemetry collector evolves from OpenCensus collector. And OpenCensus collector was largely influenced by Jaeger collector originally, like some of the code shared again. And because again, this is like a similar function, right? It's a pipeline that receives data and like forks it into some other places. And so when this very active work started in OpenTelemetry collector, this was sort of like, we realized that, okay, well, this would be a good place to pivot V2. The reason is because, again, we talked about the scope of Jaeger, right? So it's sort of like had an SDK, now it doesn't. Well, not a big loss to me. We had a collector. Is it because we needed to? Well, yes. And was there some differentiation in the collector? Yes. So OTel collector doesn't do any storage, by itself, right? It's sort of like either you use a plugin or something, or Jaeger has its own implementation for storage. So, but there's still a lot of commonality, and so that was kind of made sense, because again, we were moving towards OTel data format as ingestion format. The collector in OpenTelemetry had a kind of more interesting architecture than Jaeger, more flexible, because Jaeger was originally built just for this like narrow scope of traces, and collector takes all the signals at once, right? So that was like again a good evolution of the architecture on the back end. And plus, I think one of the biggest selling point to me was that collector has a very vast contributor ecosystem. Like with the contrib repository, you have all kinds of like exporters, some processors. A lot of those things
for the audience who doesn't know, essentially the OpenTelemetry collector is built like a data processing pipeline. So it has many receivers knowing how to receive in many protocols, like from not just from application, also from Kafka and Redis and whatnot. And then it has exporters in many protocols to send it to any backend. And in between, different processes that can do like sampling in tracing, or filtering, batching, rollups, and whatnot. So just for people to understand what the flexibility and the power that you wanted to utilize on Jaeger.
Right. And exactly. And so all this flexibility that we were technically missing in Jaeger, we've had a very long history of trying to support some sort of like pluggable model, which is blocked essentially by Go capability. Like Go plugins don't work in all the environments, and they're very painful to develop against. So we used to run like a flavor of that with the HashiCorp plugin framework, which was essentially like forking a gRPC subprocess. And then we moved away completely from that, just pure gRPC remote storage. So in OTel collector, you have another mechanism for extension where you literally just compile into the binary whatever plugin you want. And they have a builder for that. So if you want a custom flavor of what OpenTelemetry collector, you can easily build that, and you don't lose any performance due to like gRPC marshalling that you have to do otherwise if you don't have that like in binary plugin model. So
I would say even more. I would say the best practice and the standard way should be to build your own. Like unless you do a POC, don't use, just for our listeners, don't use in production the full-blown collector, because it has all the exporters. You just pay a lot of overhead for like 99% that you don't use. Build your own subset once you define it. Post the POC. The builder is the best practice for OpenTelemetry.
Right. And so we, with V2 Jaeger, we did not adopt yet the builder. So for Jaeger V2, binary is sort of hard-coded. So you can't dynamically add these extensions yet, intentionally. We're just like trying to limit the scope so that we have a announced V2. But nothing prevents us from doing that in the future, right? Because again, it's still collector. It's organized the same way as OpenTelemetry collector, and we just need to expose some of our modules internal as public modules so that you can use the builder. Right now, they're intentionally under internal packages.
Yeah, also it makes sense, because what I talked about is end user. So when an end user wants to use OpenTelemetry to collect from its own organization different sources that it has, and then so compiling a builder for its own use case. What you have is like you're a tool. So you use OpenTelemetry for a tool that you provide for your end user. That's a different case. It's like a library developer or something like that. It's a different flavor. In that case, it makes sense to be more opinionated, because you need OpenTelemetry in your case for a very specific use case. Maybe you even want to prevent some sort of use that may conflict in one way or another. So for tool builders, I think it's slightly different semantics, and you pointed out very, very nicely.
Mm-hmm. We still want eventually to support the builder, because there is certain useful potential extensions can be developed in OTel, like attribute processor, for example. Right now, if we want that, we have to hard code it in our components list, which we do. We have attributes processor, we have like tail-based sampling processor, which we import. So because those are things that we think are like very high value to have in Jaeger, and I'm glad that we don't have to implement them now. We can just like import them.
We've been waiting for so long on the tail-based sampling. Come on, that's a major news that we get as a out of the box when leveraging OpenTelemetry. So that's
Right.
definitely one of the distinct advantages. By the way, you mentioned that you've been wanting for quite some time to do V2. You talked about at least a couple of years, if not more. And I found that you had a fascinating blog post together with John Cowell, which is another maintainer of Jaeger, and also a former colleague of mine and a good friend. I pasted, by the way, the link to the Jaeger blog for the people on the live stream, and I'll definitely include that on the show notes for the podcast. And one of the things that I found interesting is you actually outlined very nicely the architectural evolution, the sort of introspection into software architecture in essence. So you called it third attempt on V2. So third time's a charm, I would put it this way. But really, in a way, it's broader than just Jaeger to actually get into the mind of an architect trying to nail down the best architecture to fit the job, and obviously with the changing environment. So where OTel is today, it's not where it was 5 years ago, obviously, and so on. So can you give us a bit about this journey to the third attempt?
Yeah, this is it's a study essentially in software engineering and running big projects, right? So with the TLDR of don't run big projects. Always run incremental projects where you actually can deliver some value incrementally to your customers, instead of basically saying, oh, we're going to implement everything. It will take us 10 years, but it will be awesome, right? In 10 years, nothing will be there at all. And so that's essentially, I think, is the gist of this 3 attempts. That the reason why the first 2 attempts sort of did not progress was because of that. Like they were kind of attempts to do V2 in essentially the same spirit as we're doing now in terms of capabilities of like what like build on top of OpenTelemetry collector. But the approach to do that was essentially kind of a big bang. We would fork code into another repository, compose using like the builder, compose some of the things, and then we would realize, you know what, this stalls, because in order to actually get to working version, which is anywhere near in capabilities to V1, you have to rebuild a lot of stuff, right? And so the biggest change in this third attempt that we've made in terms of like an approach to that is saying, let's not rebuild anything. Like, first of all, it's built directly in the same repository. It's just like a new binary it's funny that we never had a binary called Jaeger, so now we do, and that's going to be V2, because all the previous binaries had to be like Jaeger collector, all in one, and things like that. Now there's a single binary with for all the roles that you can possibly think of, and so that binary essentially reuses the same code from the repository, all of the storage implementation, which is kind of the meat of the Jaeger functionality anyway. It's like its ability to manipulate the storage, to read and write from it. And so, yeah, we kind of said like, okay, well, let's build a small adapter, because OTel operates on the OTLP data model internally. Our storage backends operate on Jaeger legacy model. And so in order to avoid rewrites, massive rewrites, we just like built an adapter, which could be somewhat inefficient initially. It doesn't block us later on to rebuild those storage implementations to be like OTLP native, which is the plan ultimately. But we didn't have to block on that, and so we said like, yeah, let's just plug them in as is. And so as a result, what happened is that V1 and V2 have been evolving in the same repository, with all the code, most of the code still shared between them. Once we actually sunset V1 in a year, there will be a bunch of code that we will still be able to delete completely. For example, we're already planning to delete Jaeger agent, because that's just not needed anymore. And the other thing that we can delete is Kafka receiver and producer that we had, right? Because in the V2, we're just importing those directly from OTel contrib. They have a plugins essentially for that, and so we don't have to maintain that. So that will go away. But some other storages like Elastic, Cassandra, like ClickHouse in the future, those would still remain proper in Jaeger as a code base. But so yeah, I think this is kind of the basic lesson there, is that the reason we were able to pull off V2 within a year with like not a lot of people working on it is because it was an incremental change rather than a big bang. Let's rewrite everything.
Yeah, and I should note to the audience who doesn't know your background, you're no stranger to OpenTelemetry. You're one of the co-founders of OpenTelemetry via the predecessor OpenTracing. Like OTel started the merge of OpenTracing and OpenCensus, as you mentioned before. And you're also a member of the both the governance and the technical committees in OTel, right?
Used to be in the governance. I retired from that, but still in the technical committee.
So you're definitely not you're still definitely not stranger, and it's also interesting because we just saw actually on the last episode I talked about it in breadth that Prometheus also adopted OpenTelemetry on its V3 release. That's the major release for Prometheus that has really come out last month. They announced it at PromCon. Actually, press the merge button on stage. So I discussed it at length with Julius Volz on the last episode. For those who want to check it out, a fascinating episode. And I find it interesting in terms of the similarity that like we see prominent projects aligning and trying to get the benefit out of OpenTelemetry so that they can focus on areas where they can make more impact. So interesting to see. And when we talk about the OpenTelemetry support, you started talking about, you mentioned a bit about the storage. So essentially, maybe zooming out for the audience who doesn't know, so Jaeger doesn't have its own, it doesn't come with a storage. You need to use an external storage. You mentioned Cassandra or Elasticsearch, or hopefully to say ClickHouse and others. So the external storage, and obviously you can use more elaborate data pipelining that will include Kafka that you said a word about, and Flink and others. So the data layer, let's call it, is external to Jaeger project, but Jaeger has the ability to obviously index the data, query the data intelligently, and so on. So can you say a word about what's the storage and data layer in Jaeger looks like, and where, because this is also something that OpenTelemetry has never intended to also do. So let's talk about first the architecture, and then we can talk about how Jaeger augments OpenTelemetry in these fronts.
Right. So in terms of architecture, fundamentally, at this point, Jaeger has two main parts. One is the collector, and another is the query layer with the UI attached to that. Right. The job of the collector is receive the telemetry from all the SDKs and the clients, perform any transformations that we want to perform, some cleanup maybe, and then format it such that it can be sent to an external storage backend. The reason that Jaeger never implemented its own database, I think the main reason is, first of all, I'm personally, I'm not a database developer necessarily, but what's more important is that tracing to me is a reasonably niche use case overall in the industry, whereas implementing and maintaining and operating a database is a very non-trivial job. So if anyone runs like an installation of Elasticsearch, they probably have like DBAs for Elasticsearch who know how to fine-tune it, how to operate it, manage it, do the upgrades, do the like resharding and all of that stuff. That's a lot of work and a lot of expertise that if we were to implement our own bespoke database just for traces, I don't think you will find that expertise anywhere in the industry, right? You would basically have to have people learn not just the Jaeger collector, but all of this like intricacies of the database management, which is going to be completely bespoke. And so that was like never on the table for us. We never thought that would make any sense to do so. Some like vendors still do that, right? So for example, we know Tempo in Grafana. It is an actual real database designed specifically for traces. I mean, they built it because it's a hosted product for them primarily, right? They didn't build it as sort of like, oh, this is a like an open source product that everyone can just use. I mean, they opened it up, but I don't know how much of that. I mean, some teams are using it, but to me, it's the same problem. It's like, how do you know how to operate a completely unknown database? It's a very hard problem to me, right? And so as a result, we said like, yeah, there's plenty of database solutions in open source that are perfectly capable of like storing traces. And can you get better with a custom solution? Sure. Like Tempo supports a unique in the industry query language. Like I helped to kind of design that with Joe, which is very interesting to me because it allows you to express queries against the traces in the graph data model, which is not possible in general with any vendors that I've seen, right? But still, it's a reasonably niche use case that kind of you can get like 90% of the value of tracing without going into that deep hole of that, like this exotic query language support and the exotic database. And I think that's the focus of Jaeger, right? We want to focus on the majority of users, not on some like very exotic niche of that. And so as a result, yeah, we said like you can bring your database essentially. And Jaeger out of the box historically supported like 4 or 5 databases. Like we have Badger, which is in memory. It's an external package. It's kind of built into Jaeger binary, but it's not something that we own technically. And then the remote ones are officially.
It's also not for production usage, right? Just to emphasize for our audience, it's not something that you'd recommend putting in production. It's more for POCs and like small all-in-one type of installations to get your hands dirty. Would that be
it's
correct?
definitely for all-in-one. It doesn't mean that it's not for production because that kind of depends on the use case. If you have a reasonably small data volume, maybe in some isolated environment, and you're fine with a single instance of Jaeger, and you just need persistence on disk for that, then the Badger is a good choice, right? But it's a single node solution ultimately. Like if you need for scaling 2 Jaeger collectors, then Badger is not going to work for you.
Let's ask differently. Do you know many who use Badger for their production environment?
I don't know. Maybe. I don't have any data on that.
Okay. Remote storages. Yeah.
Right. The main ones are Elasticsearch and Cassandra. That's like Uber originally ran Cassandra, and because again we had a team who would run Cassandra for us, right? And so we didn't have to as a tracing team, so we just like used that as a vendor product essentially. And we mentioned earlier that Jaeger had a sort of like a plugin architecture which is still supported fully. So if you want something that is not supported out of the box by Jaeger, like I don't know, Peanut or Druid, you can always implement a gRPC adapter on top of that storage, and then Jaeger will be able to talk to that. But you will lose a bit of efficiency on transmitting the data to that storage.
So going back to really the innovation here, one of the main things that come out is also the storage V2, as you nicely branded it. So can you tell us what it means?
Yeah, so storage V2 hasn't really quite come out yet. I think we do have an API which is used, but right now it's all back-breached into V1 API because that's what our implementations currently support. And there are 2 main distinctions on V2 storage V2. One is that it's using OTLP data as the kind of payloads rather than Jaeger data model in the past. So that sort of like V2, you can think of it as both remote storage as a gRPC API and as an internal interface where we use pdata structure from hotel collector, which is again, it's the OTLP data model just in Go format, right? And so that's kind of the data model. Doing that allows us higher efficiency because you don't have to translate the data model into Jaeger and then into storage one more time. And the second big change with the storage V2 is the batch support. So Jaeger storage historically has been designed as a like you write a single span at a time. I think it was a mistake in retrospect. There were some reasons for that. Like when we were prototyping it with Cassandra, that was actually a more efficient way of doing rather than writing batches into Cassandra because of the way Cassandra shards the traces. And so batching them would simply result in later fan out within the coordinator node versus collector talking directly to the right node, to the right shard of Cassandra. But for some other storage types, including like ClickHouse that we want to support in the future, for them batching is very important and actually a big improvement in efficiency. And we just didn't have that. Our whole like V1 pipeline was built around like you send a span one at a time, right, through the pipeline. And so that's the biggest change, which is already supported by Hotel pipeline, because that one is organized around batches of data points. And so storage V2 kind of natively fits into that and allows you to translate into, when it's possible, to translate into more efficient storage operations.
And you talk about, so the storage, and that's going back to Hotel. It's important to say OpenTelemetry as a project does not aim to provide storage. So it's only about the telemetry generation and the telemetry collection. So the instrumentation, the auto collector. But so one thing that is interesting, on the one hand, obviously you went with OpenTelemetry architecture, you even used the hotel operator to install it, but then again you added I think something that is very interesting. It extends beyond the original scope of OpenTelemetry, the classic OpenTelemetry, which is to support storage. And it's important to say, because it's not just people think, okay, so the operator, you write a few lines that will just spin up the Cassandra or the Elasticsearch cluster. Okay, what's the big deal? But there's a lot more to that secret sauce. That's about the creating the schema, managing it, and so on. Can you tell us a bit about what's in stake here?
Sure. So this is essentially what you said. The implementation of storage backend for Jaeger consists of managing the schema. So some tooling. Sometimes it's like offline tooling that you run once. In other cases, it could be built in directly into the implementation, as is the case with Elasticsearch. We just like automatically create the index templates. We kind of want to move to that model anyway for all storage backends. And then once you have the schema, the rest of the storage implementation is essentially taking data in some format and transforming it in an efficient way to lay out in the storage, in the schema that you've created. And different products have different schemas even for the same storage. So for like Elastic Observability as a project has its own data format for how they store data in Elastic. That format is not compatible with how Jaeger stores the spans, right? I mean, there are different trade-offs, I think, that people pursue ultimately. But that's sort of like the main purpose of the storage. It's define the schema, store the data, read the data, implement some querying capability on top of it. So Jaeger UI is agnostic to the storage. It says, find me traces with these tags, right? And then the storage implementation's job is say, okay, well, if it's a Cassandra, then there's a very specific way of you index data in Cassandra, almost like manually. So it's going to go look up through multiple index tables, join the results, and then return the results. Whereas in Elasticsearch, you just like, oh no, it can support that query directly, but then you just need to compose a very nasty looking JSON that you send to Elasticsearch, and suddenly, boom, you get like all the search results served for you, right? So those are the differences between like storage implementations, essentially.
Yeah, makes sense. And again, this is something that is really for people who are asking, okay, but what's on top of OpenTelemetry? I think this is one of the main heavyweight development that is being done. And actually, I wouldn't be surprised if this would inspire, let's say, the OpenTelemetry community in other use cases to look at OpenTelemetry beyond the original scope. So I actually find it interesting even beyond Jaeger, and I'm glad that you were the spearheading that. And let's move on to current state. So Jaeger V2 is already out with a release candidate. RC1 is already out. I also shared a link about that. So tell us a bit about what's heading next. When are we going to see the GA ready?
So GA will be this year. I don't want to promise that it will be just before the KubeCon or that we will push the button on stage to merge that. I don't think we'll get to that. So GA is by definition is kind of a funny concept to me. It's very difficult to define upfront what you want to be in the GA, right? It's almost better to say the fact that you announce GA is more important than what's in GA. because you're saying like, yeah, people come in and try it out, because there's obviously going to be some feature gaps, some things like Kubernetes operator may not be ready fully with all the like bells and whistles that we had in V1. But I didn't want to block GA announcement because of that, because ultimately the code is there, it's already usable, you can already start deploying it in production. The one thing that we do want to finish is the way that you configure your components within. So we one of the nice things that is changing in V2 for me is the fact that we're reusing OpenTelemetry configuration format. So you essentially define the same pipeline of receivers, processors, and exporters, and plus we have a bit of a customizations in some of our extensions. But then it's a familiar things for people who are already using hotel collector in other capacity, right? And so that's kind of a nice thing for us to converge. But we want that configuration to be stable so that you don't like in the next release suddenly all of your properties are invalid in the config. So that's the main thing that we want to stabilize before we announce GA. And after that, all other aspects I mostly consider like nice to have. So I don't think we need to block on them. We can continue working with like a 201, 202 releases for that later on. So yeah, it will be coming this year for sure, because we are nearly done with the configuration, like refactoring. We kind of took a look at that as saying like, okay, well, how do we rationalize? It's kind of also was good opportunity to do the cleanup that you mentioned earlier, because V1 configuration was all based on CLI flags. And doing like a hierarchical configuration through CLI flags is not a kind of like a pleasant endeavor, right? And so we kind of try to namespace some of the flags, but we were not very good in many cases, and so there wasn't like a particularly logical breakdown of the configuration. And so that was an opportunity for like a V2 config to look at it and say, yeah, like if you have, I don't know, a TLS and a timeout, maybe they should be in the same section and not in the same section where you have something like attribute processor aspects of the configuration, right?
Yeah, and I think, by the way, you talked about what's GA, but I do think that some guarantees on backward compatibility, on long-term support, on dependency isolation, these are usually the things that people look into when they want to see the major release and obviously the confidence to put it in production. So do you have any specific guarantees that you're planning around for V2?
Yeah, so the main guarantee is that once you start deploying V2 with a particular configuration, then it will be stable, so you don't have to change it release after release. The other guarantee is that because we're using the same storage implementations as V1, you can swap V1 Jaeger collector for V2 without changing anything in your storage, right? All your data will be there, all the schemas will be still supported the same way. So that continuity is very important, and that's going to be a feature of V2.
Yeah, actually, the data is the heavy part, and the fact that they don't need to somehow do all sort of an ETL and heavy migration of the data is definitely it. Do you want to say a word, actually, if we started touching it, about the migration from V1 to V2? What's going to be the experience, or what are the guidance, any best practices that you're going to lead the community when migrating into V2?
Yeah, so the main breaking change, as I mentioned, is the configuration. That's almost the only change, because all of the capabilities of Jaeger V1 were supported in V2. So we worked through this year with like our mentees from the mentorship program to bring things like SPM or service performance monitor, bring the adaptive sampling into V2, bring all of the storage back into V2. So from that point, it's a drop-in replacement. You can say like if you had a Jaeger collector before, you can have a Jaeger V2 collector now, and everything will be the same, right? There is one caveat there with Jaeger agent that I mentioned earlier. So Jaeger agent historically has only been needed because we had Jaeger SDKs using UDP exporters. So UDP exporters logically work well on the same host, not so much over the network to another host, right? Because of the fragmentation of packets. And with the OpenTelemetry SDKs, I think most of them never even supported most of the Jaeger UDP exporters. There may be a couple like Java and Go, maybe we're supporting those exporters, right? But it's definitely sort of like a not recommended and deprecated way of exporting data. We recommend to use either HTTP or gRPC reliable connection for the export without any limitations on the packet size as we had with the UDP. And so that means that you're not technically attached to the Jaeger agent being like always on the same host. You can talk directly to collector on another host, or if you still want to talk to the local host because it makes the configuration for the SDKs easier, right? You don't need to know any address of the collector. Then OpenTelemetry collector itself can be used as an agent, right? So that would be part of the migration story. So like if you are using agent for the purpose of, again, ease of configuration, then you would have to switch to OpenTelemetry collector to run it in the same capacity as a sort of like a host agent, right, and forward the data to the central tier. And so to minimize the change from V1 to V2, we actually made the decision to sunset Jaeger agent. We published it like in September last year, the intent. So we're actually 6 months late now to pull the code. So I'm doing it right now. So that yes, in V1 that's going to be a breaking change. There's not going to be any more agent in V1. But that makes it like technically not a breaking change in V2, right? Because in V2 there is simply no equivalent for agent except for if you want to run OpenTelemetry collector.
So essentially, on the breaking change side, there's the agent that's going to actually technically be even before V2, and then in V2 you said the configuration changes.
Yes.
Any other meaningful breaking changes that you expect to roll out with V2?
No, nothing else.
That's a smooth major release. Usually people are afraid major release is going to break lots of things, so it's definitely conservative.
Well,
I did want to now. Yeah, good.
One more thing is the operator in Helm for Kubernetes. Those are not going to be potentially at the same level of sophistication as the V1 versions. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't want to block GA on that because it's not like a required part of Jaeger. You can always deploy Jaeger either in a Docker or even as a binary. And I know that some people are doing that, like on Windows, for example, running it as a service. So Kubernetes management tools are of course, a big area, but they're not like 100% of usage of Jaeger. And so as a result, we say, yeah, we will have some basic versions, and we will probably need to iterate on them to bring up like equivalent capabilities that we used to have. Like for example, in the Helm in the V1 Helm chart or operator, they would orchestrate the storage for you. I'm not even sure if we want to do that anymore, because if you do that, then you can't really use operator from Hotel, right? Because Hotel doesn't orchestrate anything else other than collector. And it's a different thing. So that's going to be like potentially another like a gray area in terms of breaking changes.
That's great. So I wanted to switch and look into now the UI. So I know that some changes have been made, and I know that some people said that Jaeger UI is not the best optimal experience when they maybe comparing it to commercial products out there. So I'm wondering if you want to share what's expected on the UI front, now, and maybe also looking forward and what's heading next.
I would still say that Jaeger UI has a lot of capabilities that many other tools don't have because we've historically built them in. Trace comparison is a very powerful feature, which I'm not that seen that often in the industry, right? We had critical path analysis in the UI, something also recently added, which is an important feature. So I think there's it's hard to unpack what specifically people mean when they say that. I think the one aspect of Jaeger UI that I would definitely agree that is sort of lacking in capabilities is that it has never been built as a sort of like an APM tool where you have like aggregate signals about your services, and then you look maybe at time series, and then you drill down into traces, right? So this is a kind of a very common workflow. We did build a service performance monitor for that. it's a bit clunky to set up because it requires a dependency on a time series storage, right? Like a Prometheus. So and it's not really that well integrated anyway afterwards. So you can kind of like, you can identify like a time range maybe for the time series, and then you still go back to the Jaeger classic behavior of like searching for traces. So this is one area that we plan to improve with the integration with ClickHouse, because, and potentially with Elasticsearch too, because with those backends, we can actually do a lot of like SPM related functionality directly on the storage, so they can provide aggregates. You can query for them for trends and things like that, and at the same time they connect you directly. So it's that those queries are based on the trace data as opposed to some like metrics extracted from the trace data. So they reduce the footprint of your operations because you don't need to have another storage just for that purpose. So it's easier to operate, and then we can support a lot more interesting queries that has been historically, I think, a gap in Jaeger because of our original implementation with Cassandra. Cassandra was very limited in terms of like how it was able to index the traces, and potentially like in Cassandra 5, which we support technically, but we didn't change any schema to support that. There might be capabilities there that would kind of bring it closer to the other backends, but we were stuck with behind this like lowest common denominator essentially situation with Jaeger, and so like a query language was a bit clunky or restricted in terms of what you can query.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to move into something really different from the technological side. One thing that I love with this version 2, and actually it started with V1 as well, is that the advancement was done with the involvement of new folks joining the community through mentorship programs. This for me is really the power of the community, and we've seen the LFX mentorship, the Google Summer of Code, and so on. Can you tell us a bit about this, Jeremy?
Yeah, so Jaeger has historically participated in various mentorships programs, like we've done a few outreachy mentorships, but at the time we were not using them as a sort of like a vehicle to advance the project, but more as just like a mentorship, saying like, okay, yeah, someone wants to learn something, we can provide them with a project which is not critical for the Jaeger itself, and that's how some of those things were done. And then when the Linux Foundation started doing these mentorships very frequently, like 3 times a year, 3 terms, and not limited by the number of people who can apply or who can get actually internship, right? That was like a realization to me that we can actually not only help these new students usually to kind of grow into the industry and open source, but also make them work on the projects which are very strategic for the Jaeger, not just something that, okay, it's a nice to have, we can do that, right? And so that's been the direction since then. So the first term I think we've done with LFX was around all kinds of UI improvements and upgrades. So Jaeger UI kind of lagged behind in terms of like its React version, and so we've made a major push of upgrading all of the packages. This was done with the LFX mentorship, which was like, I don't think we would have been able to pull it off without that, right? And then after seeing success of that, I said, okay, well, if we actually want to get really serious about V2, we need sustained contributions, not just someone coming in and doing one PR and then disappearing, that happens often in Jaeger, but that doesn't help you move towards strategic directions. And then with the mentorships, we were able to put the people on actually strategic projects, like implementation of storage backends. That was our spring theme for this year. Like all of these storage backends were supported now in V2, right? And so like, and then the fall term is all about Helm and Kubernetes operator support, right? So again, like a very focused area, but it requires sustained development from the people, not just like a drive-by PR. So that, yeah, I think that was very successful model that we stumbled upon.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm really happy to see that it's actually growing, and I've seen that, by the way, also for other projects like Outreachy has been proven amazingly well for OpenTelemetry project and others. So really happy to see that working out well for Jaeger. And I want to now put aside Jaeger, because you talk about your own experience. You've been living and breathing observability in general, and obviously distributed tracing in particular for so many years. We talked about your past at Uber and currently at Meta. So I want to, and by the way, we had an episode with David Ostrovsky of Meta that shared, I think he's handles like the decision-making layer and fraud detection, that he uses observability infrastructure that your team and the other teams in your layer provide. So it's nice to see the layering of observability within large organizations, and how you get the consumers within the organization and so on. So it was a fascinating episode. I shared the link also here for the people on the live stream, and I'll share it also on the show notes. So I want to get your take on your experience, and you gave me some interesting bit also about machine learning observability. So happy to get your sneak peek for the ending of the episode.
Yeah, I think we still have unresolved problem within the observability space of correlation of telemetry signals of different types, right? So a couple years ago, we published a paper on schema-first telemetry, which was advocating for a telemetry production where you essentially promise a data contract to your consumers, right? A lot of telemetry signals, like in the big organization, are produced by sort of like a small number of teams and used by the whole company, right? So if you can imagine like a service mesh. Service mesh can provide a very valuable set of signals about arbitrary service, right? And so everyone can build health checks, dashboards, all kinds of investigation run books based on those signals, but it's a small team that provides them. And so those are kind of like a very high leverage data sets. And so when you provide such a data set in telemetry, you really should like keep your some sort of like a promise that you have a backwards compatibility. You're not going to introduce things that's going to break everyone's dashboards or queries for alerts, right? And so how you do that? Well, there are no real techniques today, right? So schema-first telemetry is one such technique, because it says like, yeah, you actually publish into a pre-declared schema, right? And when you do that, and you do that not just for metrics, but for traces, for logs, for structured events, and you still define the schemas with the consistent semantics, then it gives the observability tools the power to sort of like correlate that and drive automatic insights about that. And so OpenTelemetry is taking a bit of that approach with the semantic conventions, which is good. It's not as good as the schema first, because with semantic convention, no one actually forces you to at the compile time to like not put some garbage into the data, right? Whereas with the schema first, you can do a lot better. And so that's one big area that we still personally kind of at Meta investing into that. And then the ML, the emergence of ML kind of opened up another whole ball of wax of problems in the observability space. Very interesting one. And not just because there are topics such as data observability, which sometimes have different meaning to like a typical service observability, right? You're not looking for health of your service, but for some accuracy of the data or like lineage and things like that. With ML, some of the interesting challenges are the fact that a lot of ML models, or even not ML models, but like when you think about classic observability, you are talking to engineers as your customers, right? So they are the ones who are going to instrument their service, their code. And who is going to do that for ML? Because we have ML engineers. Those are people who usually never thought of observability at all, right? They're like all about like a modeling and the business functionality in ML. And so how do you make their work still observable? Because they still need to debug. They still need to like, detect stuck jobs, and stuck jobs meaning that they're not making progress in the training, things like that. Those are very specific, again, ML specific challenges, right? And plus a lot of it is open source code as well. It's like PyTorch, and so like a lot of developers just work on GitHub in ML engineers, not in the sort of like in the internal repositories where we have all these like advanced SDKs that for our internal systems. They don't even have access to that. They have like So OpenTelemetry, ironically, is kind of was the path for Meta to get into. Was like we've never been like able to heavily adopt it in the services world, but with ML we can, because there's a clear need for that, right? It's like when you have open source code, what else do you do? So those are like two kind of interesting things that keep my mind occupied recently.
It's fascinating, actually, because I do know, and again, David Ostrovsky also mentioned that in that episode, that it's so elaborate that it gets all the way to the ID, and the experience is so, for developers in Meta, is so integrative with the tool chain that, like, common things that we do, laymen out there outside of Meta, you don't need to do. But as you said, ML sort of opened up a new, you call it ball of wax, that is not covered by the this well laid out set of tools. And actually is very much open source driven and Git driven, and so GitOps driven. So it's very, very interesting. This is actually the entrance point for things such as OpenTelemetry. Thanks for sharing that with us, and do share with me the link for that white paper that you mentioned, and I will share that on the show notes as well. This definitely something that will interest the listeners on the show. And with that, I think we're getting to the end of the show. So I wanted to thank you, Yuri, for joining me. Just before we finish, I want one note to our audience to remind them next week about Open Source Observability Day. So if you share, you're here following the show, so you're passionate about it and you're interested, do check it out on October 24th, sharing here the link again. I'll be speaking there about OpenTelemetry and many other speakers there that you're well familiar with, and the show here, the OpenObservability Talks itself will be there. So do join us. A good place to share, free, online, and a good place for a conversation. And with that, I'd like to thank you, Yuri, for joining me on this show again, coming back to the show. Thanks so much about that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was fun.
And I'd like to thank all our listeners for joining us on this episode. The live stream, as always, all the episodes are available on all your favorite podcast apps and platforms, or on YouTube. And if you do consume that on the podcast apps, do know that we live stream the episodes as well. So if you want to chime in with your questions, your comments, and watch us live, then do follow us on Twitter or X at OpenObserve, where you will get the times for the live streams, and you can also chime in between the episodes with your take on things and carry on the conversation. And with that, I'll say goodbye until next month's episode. And as always, may the open source be with you.